I was certain it would be a regular business meeting. Rick and I shared common business interests. Although we rarely crossed paths professionally, our companies operated in related fields, and fate had finally brought us together. Rick, my husband's father, was a respected specialist with years of experience, always exuding an aura of confidence and maturity. His presence always threw me off balance a little, especially when we found ourselves in the same room. As soon as he entered, I caught his attentive gaze, and he didn't look away. He sat across from me, straightened his posture as if preparing for an especially important conversation. I tried to focus on the meeting's topic, but I felt his attention unsettling me. At one point, I even noticed his gaze lingering on my legs, which were more exposed than usual. I had chosen a short skirt that morning without giving it much thought. But now I realized it hadn't gone unnoticed. We discussed the new project, and I tried to keep the conversation professional. However, Rick skillfully shifted the topic, as though speaking not just about the project but about me. "Laura, I must say, you truly stand out here. Confidence, beauty, intelligence. It's all in you in such a harmonious way," he said, looking directly into my eyes with a warm smile. Those words made me shiver unexpectedly. I was used to compliments, but from Rick. And in that tone, it felt different. I knew I should maintain a serious expression, but I felt my heart beat faster at his words. When I looked up at him, he briefly averted his eyes as if sensing my unease. But his smile remained. He was completely composed, but his glances and tone left a feeling of subtle flirtation. After the meeting, when he said goodbye, Rick held my hand a bit longer than politeness required. I felt his fingers tighten around my palm, and in his gaze I caught something beyond mere courtesy. On the drive home, I tried to shake off the strange excitement that lingered after our conversation. It all felt like some kind of game. His compliments, his gaze, his touch. Every time I recalled his smile, my heart would beat faster. I knew Rick was a master at saying things between the lines, and I should be careful around him. But something kept me from shaking the thought that his words and gaze held something more. When I returned home, I headed straight to the gym. I was used to taking care of my figure, and I considered working out a great way to clear my mind. But even while running, my thoughts kept returning to Rick, to his words, to his touch. In that moment, I realized that this was not just a business meeting. It had left a mark I couldn't ignore. Something was beginning, something more than I wanted to admit. The corporate dinner I attended was supposed to be just another gathering to discuss business achievements and formal toasts. I was ready to spend the evening like any other among colleagues, but when I saw Rick by the entrance, my resolve wavered. He noticed me immediately and headed straight for me, his eyes radiating warm confidence, and there was something more than a simple greeting in his smile. Rick greeted me with a light touch on my shoulder, and I felt an electric shock run through my body from that fleeting touch. His flirting had become more open, and it was hard not to notice. During dinner, Rick kept finding reasons to be near me, either to pass a dish or to exchange a few words. He turned to me as I raised my glass and joked, "A toast to the most beautiful and talented women in our company." His gaze lingered on me longer than was appropriate, and I felt a slight blush rise to my cheeks. It seemed he was enjoying every second of our interaction. When he accidentally touched my hand while passing a napkin, I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to regain my composure, but his presence was practically hypnotic. I noticed his gaze lingering on my neck a little longer than usual, and the attentiveness in his eyes added to my confusion. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the conversation, but one thought kept circling in my mind. Why now? Why did he choose me? Later, when the dinner was coming to an end and the guests began to leave, Rick approached me as if he had waited for a moment when we'd be alone. He stood beside me, leaning slightly closer, and quietly said, "Laura, you're not only an incredible professional, but such a beautiful woman. Sometimes I think you don't even realize how unique you are." His voice was soft, but there was a hidden intensity in his words. It became hard for me to breathe. His words unsettled me, stripping away my usual confidence. I didn't know what to say. My gaze flitted from his eyes to the floor, and I tried to stay calm, but inside, I was beginning to realize that something important and irreversible was happening between us. My mind tried to resist, but my heart was beating faster, responding to a rhythm that Rick dictated. For the first time, I realized I was attracted to him, and this thought frightened me more than I could have imagined. I still wasn't ready to admit it. The thought that my husband was his son, that this attraction could destroy everything I had built in my life, scared me. But with each new glance, each word from Rick, a desire was growing inside me that was becoming increasingly irresistible. He knew what he was saying, and he knew how to evoke emotions in me that I tried not to think about. Stepping back now seemed impossible, yet the fear of consequences held me on the edge of this precipice. When I returned home, a storm of emotions churned inside me. I tried to focus on everyday tasks, but thoughts of Rick completely overtook me. Every attempt to distract myself was futile. His voice, his touch, his words, all of it had sunk into my mind like an invisible net I couldn't escape. Desperately trying to regain my sense of reality, I decided to talk to Mark, hoping that spending time with my husband might help dispel this obsession. But even in that moment, watching Mark, I realized I no longer felt that same attraction. His gaze once made me feel warmth, and his touch brought comfort and peace. But now it all seemed so ordinary, as if we had become mere shadows of each other. I continued to fulfill my obligations around the house, keeping up the conversation. But I felt more and more like an observer, as though I were merely playing a role without true awareness of what I was doing. My actions became mechanical, as if I were just performing, lacking any real sense of presence. In the days that followed, I met Rick again for a business meeting. This time I couldn't help but notice the way he looked at me. His eyes held something far more than simple interest. At one point, when we were alone in the conference room, he moved closer than usual, and I felt my breathing grow shallow. His hand brushed against mine, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. It was a moment when everything felt inevitable. He leaned closer, and in a soft, almost whispering tone, he said, "You have no idea how many times I've dreamed, looking at your curves, of having you in my life, not just as my son's wife." His words were direct and shocking, as if breaking down the last barrier between us. I barely had time to process the meaning when I felt his lips on mine. It was a fleeting yet overwhelming touch, like a brief burst of something transcendent. His kiss was filled with warmth and passion that left me breathless. I pulled back, trying to regain control, but something inside me had changed. I realized that this kiss was a point of no return. Everything I knew up to this moment no longer mattered. A thought crossed my mind, that this opened an opportunity for me not only to feel desired, but also to advance my career. With his support, unique advantages could be within my reach. But this realization only added to the confusion. How far was I willing to go with these feelings? Where was the line between desire and duty? When I returned home, I understood that my life would never be the same again. This kiss had changed everything. I tried to convince myself it was just a fleeting attraction, something that could be forgotten, but deep inside, I knew this was the beginning of something inevitable. I didn't know what to do with this feeling. It was like a storm pulling me deeper, forcing me to reconsider everything I held dear. And for the first time in my life, I began to question my marriage, myself, and what I truly wanted from life. After that kiss with Rick, I tried to convince myself that it was all a mistake. I decided that I had to stop, to bring my life back to what it was, and to put an end to these questionable feelings. Surely one meeting couldn't change me so profoundly and turn my entire life upside down. I knew the best choice would be to forget about Rick and the feelings he had awakened in me. But despite all my efforts, my thoughts kept returning to him. His words echoed in my mind, his gaze followed me. I decided to focus on my work and my family, trying to keep myself under control. I tried to avoid encounters with Rick, telling myself it was the right decision. However, fate had other plans. And at the next business meeting, he was there. As soon as I saw him, all my plans crumbled. Rick seemed completely sure of himself, and his gaze was even more open than before. He didn't look away, as if he knew that my resistance was just an attempt to hide my true feelings. When we had a moment alone, he approached me, and I felt something turn over inside me. "Did you really think you could just ignore me like that?" he said with a slight smirk, a quiet challenge in his voice. I tried to act like everything was under control, but I knew my emotions were starting to escape my rational grasp. Rick moved closer, and I felt his hand on my waist. His touch was too insistent to pretend it didn't matter. My first reaction was to push him away, but something held me back. His hand slid higher, and he pulled me closer, so close that resisting was no longer an option. His words echoed in my mind, and I realized that the more I tried to avoid him, the stronger my attraction grew. From that moment, Rick became more determined. He no longer hid his interest, and every time we crossed paths, he found ways to show his desire. In his words, his glances, his touches. I tried to suppress my feelings, but every time he was near, I felt a fire ignite inside me. His confidence and persistence tore down all the barriers I tried to build. I knew that if I continued like this, I would be at the mercy of emotions I couldn't escape. An inner conflict was tearing me apart. I knew that being with Rick was a mistake, that this affair could destroy my marriage and my whole life, but at the same time I felt my desire becoming irresistible, filling me more with each moment spent with him. This man awakened something in me so powerful that I could no longer ignore it. Each touch became a test of endurance, each look another reminder that what was between us was more than just a fleeting attraction. I tried to hide my feelings, but more and more I realized that I wouldn't succeed. I stood on the edge, between duty and passion, knowing that sooner or later I would have to make a choice. But the inner conflict grew stronger with each passing moment, and my control over the situation weakened. A few days passed since our last encounter, and it felt as though the tension between us had reached its peak. I tried to live as I had before, but everything had become a facade. My world had already begun to crumble. Each memory of Rick made my heart tighten with overwhelming desire. And then I received his message. He proposed a weekend together, officially to discuss an upcoming project. But I knew the true intent was far different. I hesitated for a long time, but ultimately I made the decision. Something inside me broke. I could no longer ignore the feelings that consumed me entirely. At first there was a sense of fear, but it vanished when I realized I didn't want to pretend anymore. I was ready to let go of everything and surrender to this feeling. We met on the outskirts of town, and as soon as we were together, I felt the inevitability ignite between us. The place he had chosen was secluded, far from prying eyes and the bustle of the city. It was hard to believe this was just a business trip. The air was thick with a sense of dangerous yet enticing union, and I realized nothing could stop me from surrendering fully to my desires. We were alone, and the seclusion was intoxicating. Rick watched me as he slowly came closer, and I knew this moment would be the point of no return. My breath caught as he placed his hands on my shoulders, pulling me towards him. Our lips met once more. But this time, there was no restraint. It was filled with passion and the force we had tried to suppress for so long. Every touch, every movement felt like an explosion of emotion. At that moment, there was no marriage, no role of him as my husband's father, only the two of us and the fire that bound us. I felt his hands on my skin, his lips on mine, and the world around us disappeared. His kisses and confident hands erased all the barriers I had built, breaking down the last remnants of my doubts. Lost in this moment, I realized I could never go back to my old life. My weakness before this feeling was absolute, and for the first time, I allowed myself not to think about the future. It was dangerous. It was wrong. But right now, I didn't want to know what lay ahead. All I needed was him. When it was over, I lay beside him, feeling my emotions intertwined with guilt and liberation. It was a moment of utter vulnerability, and I knew that this weekend had become the culmination of my inner struggle. Returning to my normal life as if nothing had happened was now impossible. I knew this day had changed everything. I could no longer deny what was between us, and I understood that the consequences would be irreversible. My world had finally collapsed, and I was left facing a new, terrifying reality. With each passing day after our weekend together, I realized more clearly that my life would never return to what it once was. Every attempt to get back to my usual routine, to the comfort and stability it used to bring, felt meaningless. Deep inside, I felt a growing sense of irreversibility, as though I had crossed a line from which there was no return. Whenever I was with Mark, an overwhelming sense of unease and detachment took over me. His touch and his gaze, once familiar and close, now felt like a constant reminder that I was hiding something deeply intimate from him. I realized that my connection with Rick had overshadowed everything my marriage had once meant to me. But with this realization came an unbearable guilt. A guilt that hit me like a snowball growing bigger every time I found myself unable to get Rick out of my mind. Each encounter, every glance filled with passion and promise, made me feel as if I were betraying Mark. The situation was made even more complicated by the fact that Rick was not just a secret lover, he was my husband's father. Sometimes this thought flashed through my mind with a searing pain. At moments, I felt as if I could not bear the weight of this secret, as if it would crush me from within, destroying everything that remained of the person I used to be. Yet Rick showed no intention of letting me go. He grew more confident and insistent, as if he sensed that my heart already belonged to him. When we met, he looked at me intently, as if trying to read each of my fears and doubts, only to dissolve them with his presence. His looks and touches became bolder, and in his words, I heard increasing certainty that what was happening between us was inevitable. I felt as though my desires were now dictating my actions, as if I was no longer in control, but was instead being controlled by them. I tried to resist, to convince myself that this could destroy my family, wrecking the life I had spent so long building. But every word felt empty. The snowball grew larger each day, and I was terrified of what this might all turn into. I could feel this connection with Rick pulling me deeper, and I understood that I had already lost control of the situation. Each time, my moral scruples became more intense, but at the same time, I knew I could no longer escape. All that was left for me was to wait until the consequences became evident, and this growing snowball finally shattered the life I once strived so hard to build. In the past few days, Mark had begun acting strangely. There was a wary look in his eyes, and his attention to my actions started to unsettle me. He asked more questions, tried to spend more time with me, as if trying to understand what was going on. His concern, which once brought warmth, now felt like an invisible chain binding me. Every look, every question, even the most innocent ones, seemed like a test. My meetings with Rick had become more cautious, but the tension lingered. We found any excuse to cross paths, knowing that a single moment could put everything at risk. Then, one evening, when Rick and I met again, I felt how close I was to the edge of a precipice. We were in his office, a secluded place where I thought no one would find us. Between us, the attraction flared, and I allowed myself to forget everything, diving into that forbidden moment. But our private moment was short-lived. The office door burst open, and there stood Mark. His eyes reflected a mix of confusion, anger, and shock, all swirling together in a torrent of emotion that made my heart stop. The seconds stretched on, and despite the horror of the moment, I couldn't look away. Mark stood there looking at Rick and me, and his gaze, filled with rage and pain, pierced right through me. "Laura, what is going on here?" His voice was sharp, demanding, and I felt a cold sweat trickle down my spine. I tried to answer, but the words caught in my throat. Every excuse and justification I had rehearsed in my mind dissolved in his icy stare. Rick tried to intervene, but it only heightened Mark's fury. I realized that I could no longer hide, that there was no retreat from what had already happened. Mark stepped closer, his voice growing even harsher. "You made your choice, Laura. Now live with it." I felt my own words, all the excuses I had repeated to myself, crumble before his bitter truth. This moment was the final line, beyond which I would have to face the consequences. When he left, a heavy silence settled in the room, suffocating and oppressive. I felt that my life now depended entirely on the choice I had made, and that choice had destroyed everything that once was. When Mark found out the truth, my life as I knew it began to unravel at a relentless pace. His silent presence at home became unbearable, and soon silence turned into a storm. He could no longer hide his feelings, and one evening it all erupted into a harsh confrontation. His words were filled with bitterness and anger, and for the first time I saw the full force of his pain and disappointment. Every accusation he made hit me like a hammer, but I couldn't justify or deny anything. I knew that I had chosen this path myself. Our argument turned into a brutal exchange, during which Mark didn't hold back in expressing his feelings. He demanded to know if Rick was the only one, or if this was just one episode among others. I felt his words tearing apart everything that had once bound us together. His eyes, once filled with love and care, now looked at me with distrust and contempt. This moment became the bitter realization that there was no way back. That same day, Rick called and insisted on meeting. His voice was calm but firm, and I understood that he too was tired of hiding. When we met, he took my hands and looked me straight in the eyes. "Laura," he said, "I'm ready to destroy everything if it means you'll be with me. No more games or evasions. I want us to be together, without looking back at the past." His words sounded like both a promise and a challenge. I felt the strength of his desire, his determination, and at the same time realized that this choice would leave me with no way to return. My inner struggle reached its peak. On one side was the destruction of the family I had built with Mark, a life full of memories and shared plans. On the other was the storm of emotions for Rick, both terrifying and exhilarating. I knew that choosing Rick would mean leaving behind everything that had once mattered to me. But going back to my old life had become impossible. I had changed, and that path was now closed to me forever. After that meeting, I understood that my choice would now completely alter my life. Inside, I was saying goodbye to my former self, the woman who once sought stability and peace. Now all I could do was walk the new path I had chosen, whatever it might bring. After the breakup with Mark, I was left alone. Our home, which had once been a place of peace and warmth, now reminded me of everything I had destroyed. In the silence of my thoughts, I was confronted by the consequences of my actions. Mark was gone, leaving behind an emptiness in which I could find neither answers nor relief. I was haunted by guilt, a constant reminder of my betrayal and the loss I had caused. Rick continued to support me, trying to be there for me and offering comfort when he could. But even his confidence couldn't bring me peace. I saw him becoming more invested in our relationship, as if this path was the only right one for him. But for me, it became a new source of doubt. In moments when we were together, I found myself wondering more and more, what did I truly need? Could I be happy if I continued down this path? Uncertainty overwhelmed me, and I felt my inner world falling apart. On one side, there was the attraction to Rick that had already led to this destruction. On the other, there were memories of Mark, of the life we had shared that I had chosen to erase. These feelings twisted into a closed circle, and every question I asked myself took me further from an answer. It felt as though I was trapped in an emotional vacuum. Neither Rick nor Mark could provide a foundation for me anymore. Each of them was tied to pain and loss, and I didn't know how to choose. The inner conflict grew stronger, and I realized that I couldn't resolve this situation. My doubts were tearing me apart, leaving me without a way out or hope for clarity. I knew my world would never be the same. The questions continued to spin in my mind, and the answers only grew more elusive. I made my choice. Rick became the one person who could fill the emptiness that had grown inside me. We decided to start a new life together, ignoring everything that had been destroyed for the sake of this connection. It seemed that the passion binding us would bring happiness and free me from the pain of past losses. But soon, I realized that this new happiness was built on the ruins of my former life, and that realization wouldn't let me rest. Rick became my only source of joy, but he was also the source of a deep-seated fear. Every moment spent with him was filled with intense emotions, yet even this whirlwind of passion couldn't overshadow the sense that my life no longer belonged to me. I felt as if I were chasing feelings that couldn't fill the void inside. Instead of finding satisfaction, I felt myself growing more and more dependent on Rick, but this dependence offered no peace. With each encounter, I sensed an inner emptiness growing stronger. Despite the passion we shared, something deeper was missing. I saw how my decisions had become destructive to my own life, and this realization dulled any attempt to feel truly happy. Rick had become a crucial part of my existence, but along with him came a shadow of self-destruction that I couldn't shake. I understood that by choosing Rick, I had destroyed everything that once held value for me. The happiness I had longed for proved fleeting and fragile. It felt as if I had given up everything for this man. But instead of fulfillment and peace, I was left with an inner void that grew more profound each day. With each day spent with Rick, the feeling of guilt and destruction grew stronger. I realized that my betrayal had hurt not only Mark but also his family, including his mother, for whom our stable life had been a source of comfort. I hadn't just destroyed my marriage, I had torn apart the world around us, like a stone thrown into a quiet lake, sending ripples across its surface. I could see how my secret life had ultimately driven a wedge between Mark and his father, and that realization became an unbearable burden. Then one day, Mark returned. There was no pity or reconciliation in his eyes, only cold determination and anger. He looked at me as if I were a complete stranger. Finally, he spoke, and his voice, filled with bitterness, cut through me. "You didn't just destroy our marriage, Laura. You ruined the lives of everyone around us. My mother, she was so proud of our family, our stability. And now, what does she have left?" His words tore me apart inside, and I had no response. His voice carried the pain not just for himself but for his mother, who had considered me almost a daughter. At that moment, I knew his forgiveness was something I would never receive. I tried to justify my actions, to tell him that we had problems, that I had my reasons, but Mark didn't want to hear it. His face remained hard, as if he had already made up his mind long ago. The words I tried to gather felt meaningless against this wall of rejection and resentment. I could see that every argument I made only added to his pain and anger. This conversation became the final point of no return. I realized that any hope of reconciliation was gone. Everything that had once bound us had crumbled under the weight of my mistake. There was no future here, no forgiveness, and I knew I had to learn to live with that. I had lost not only my family but also a part of myself. When Mark, his family, and our empty home disappeared from my life, I was left to face the brutal truth. All that remained were my own actions and their consequences. The life I thought I would build with Rick had not brought the relief I had hoped for. Instead, each day reminded me of the choice I had made and of everything I had lost. I lived with the awareness that everything that once mattered to me had been destroyed. Rick, by my side, was a reminder of passion, but I could also see that our relationship, built on my mistake, could not bring me peace. He didn't understand the depth of my disappointment, and every gesture of his, every hopeful, passionate gaze only amplified my inner conflict. Instead of the happiness and harmony I had hoped for, I felt only emptiness, which filled with increasingly heavy thoughts. My past and present twisted into an unsolvable knot of guilt and regret, and I realized that the path I had taken was not accidental. Every choice I had made to bring me here had been part of my own self-destruction. I could not deny the obvious. My decisions had led me to this point, and there was no going back. Memories of Mark, his mother, and our home played over and over in my mind, and the realization of my betrayal became unbearable. I had ruined their lives, my life, and now each day was merely a reminder of losses that could never be undone. Even with Rick's presence beside me, I felt the emptiness inside me deepen, as not even he could fill that void. Our encounters, once fiery, now seemed only to reflect the hollowness I felt. Gradually, I began to understand that punishment for my actions was inevitable. Everything I had destroyed would leave its mark not only on my soul, but in reality. It felt as if I were waiting for everything to collapse completely, and I knew I deserved it. Thoughts of retribution haunted me. I began to expect that someday everything would finally fall apart, leaving me alone with this pain, and that feeling grew constantly. Each day I tried to find some kind of solution, but I understood that my actions were irreversible. I could no longer justify myself, convincing myself that all this had been for the sake of some new life. I had destroyed my family, my future, and my soul, and I no longer saw any point in trying to turn back or fix what had been shattered forever. As time went on, the weight of my choices only grew, and I began to feel that even with Rick, I was still alone. One evening, I finally realized that I could no longer ignore the emptiness that had been consuming me. I decided to meet with Rick, knowing that this conversation would be one of the hardest of my life. When we met, Rick looked at me with a mixture of concern and frustration. He seemed to sense that something was wrong, and as soon as I started speaking, his face hardened. I told him that I couldn't continue like this, that I needed to step away and find myself again. He looked at me in shock, and I saw a flash of pain cross his face. "You're just going to walk away now?" he said, anger rising in his voice. "I gave up everything for you, Laura. Everything. And now, just like that, you're choosing to leave me?" I felt a pang of guilt at his words, but I knew what I had to do. I met his gaze, trying to stay calm, and replied, "Rick, that was your choice. You made that decision because it was what you wanted, and I can't carry the weight of that. I made my own choices, and now I have to make one more. I'm choosing to be alone." He shook his head, unable to believe what I was saying. "You're throwing away what we have? After everything we went through to be together?" I took a deep breath, fighting back tears. "Rick, I need this. I need to find my way again, alone. Maybe we thought we could build something together, but for me, it's only brought more pain. I can't live like this anymore." His face softened, but there was still a look of deep hurt. He looked away, as if searching for something to say, but then turned back to me with a resigned expression. "Fine, but don't forget, Laura, you chose this too." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing alone, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. Watching him go was harder than I had expected, but I knew I had made the right choice. I was left with nothing but silence and a sense of solitude, yet for the first time, that solitude felt like something I needed. As I returned home, I accepted that I had to face whatever came next on my own. The future was uncertain, and I had no clear path ahead. But I knew that I had chosen to walk this path alone, and in that choice, I found a sense of calm amidst the emptiness. Alone at last, I felt the full weight of my choices and the consequences they had brought. Solitude became my constant companion, and the silence that filled my life was nothing like I had imagined. I had lost Mark, Rick, and seemingly the very meaning of my existence. But in this new, empty space, I found a chance to finally look within, to see who I had become, and to recognize that little remained of the person I once was. Every day was a battle with myself, with pain and disappointment. I began by working on myself, trying to find stability in the simplest things: walks, reading, self-reflection. I asked myself questions I had once been too afraid to confront. I was forced to face my deepest fears and regrets. My past, my life, my choices, they were all bitter lessons, but also, in a way, a new starting point. The meaning I had once found in stability and family now seemed like a distant illusion. I no longer knew what I had been searching for, and my heart was filled with regret for the lost time and broken connections. But at the same time, I realized that I could never go back to my old life. The past was forever behind me, and no amount of regret could bring it back. My future remained uncertain, and that was the hardest truth to face. Each day, I took small steps into the unknown, understanding that I would need to rebuild my life from scratch. Solitude no longer frightened me as it once had. It became a part of me, helping me find the strength I had lost. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I felt that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one that held a more complex and honest version of myself. Step by step, I began again, realizing that I would now see the world through different eyes.